Mr. Osborne is African American. His defense attorney was white. This defense attorney refused to properly represent Mr. Osborne because, in his horrifying words, "That little nigger deserves the chair." This treachery resulted in the jurors not learning the truth about Mr. Osborne, truth about his worth as a man, a human being, and about his frailties. This body can and should consider these truths. Curtis Osborne was sentenced to death for the murders of Lisa Seaborn and Arthur Jones in Griffin, Georgia, in 1991. While we may have made great strides in race relations in this nation, in the South, and in Georgia, 17 years ago in rural Georgia things were often different.
Since that time, there have been improvements in the justice system in Griffin. But initially, I was not satisfied with the way the justice system operated. I felt at that time that the justice system was unfair to minorities.
Miss Evans was appointed to represent Mr. Osborne, but because she had never tried a murder case, Johnny Mosteller, the contract public defender in Griffin, was also appointed. As Miss Evans explains, Mr. Mosteller did not prepare to defend Mr. Osborne.
I also attempted to meet with Mr. Mosteller at the jail so that we could sit down with Curtis Osborne and discuss the facts of the case. I never got that opportunity. I withdrew from the case because I did not feel that I could adequately prepare to try that case, and I also felt during this period of time that Mr. Mosteller wasn't adequately preparing to defend Curtis in this matter.
Miss Evans' concerns about Mr. Mosteller were well-founded. In a death penalty case, a defendant's background, life story, and mental condition is always relevant at sentencing. An investigation by Mr. Mosteller into Mr. Osborne's background and social history would have been funded by the state. Mr. Mosteller did not conduct such an investigation. An independent mental health expert would have been funded by the state. Mr. Mosteller did not hire one. Why did Mr. Mosteller not hire any experts to investigate Osborne's family history of mental illness? The answer to that question was something more shocking than anything I heard in my first year of law school.
I represented Curtis Osborne during his federal habeas corpus proceedings. During that time, I spoke to Gerald Huey, a white man represented by Johnny Mosteller at the same time he represented Curtis Osborne. Mr. Huey told me, and he swore under oath, how Mosteller said he would betray Curtis. In reading from his affidavit, Mr. Huey states, "The first time I recall Mr. Mosteller saying anything about Curtis Osborne's case was when he said, 'The little nigger deserves the death penalty.' I was shocked because I knew Mr. Osborne had not yet gone to trial. That wasn't the only time Mr. Mosteller said something like that, though. He said the money he would spend on me was going to be a lot more than he would spend on Mr. Osborne because that little nigger deserves the chair, he said." Mr. Mosteller made similar comments to me both before and after Mr. Osborne's trial.
Most importantly, Evans recalls an occasion, in open court, when Mosteller was accused of calling another black client a nigger, and did not deny doing so.
During the time that I practiced law in Griffin, I do remember an incident which occurred around or about 1992 when Derek Middlebrooks appeared in open court and stated that Mr. Mosteller had referred to him as one dumb nigger because he would not accept the plea recommendation of the state. The court inquired of Mr. Mosteller whether or not he had made that statement to Mr. Middlebrooks. Mr. Mosteller replied, "I do not recall."
How could an attorney not recall whether he had used the worst slur in the English language toward his client? Either Mosteller's answer was simply a lie, and Mosteller did recall addressing Derek Middlebrooks in this manner, or else it was common enough for him to address clients with a slur he really could not recall. Either way, this exchange corroborates the affidavit of Gerald Huey.
Mr. Mosteller's use of racial slurs is also preserved in court documents. In a transcript I was only recently able to obtain, Derek Middlebrooks, a client of Mr. Mosteller's, informs the court that he would like a new lawyer because Mr. Mosteller used the word nigger in his presence. The transcript reads, "He indicated to me that he couldn't go up there around them niggers because them niggers would kill him." Mr. Middlebrooks goes on to say, I find it kind of hard to have an attorney to represent me when he uses those type of words. Mr. Mosteller, upon being questioned by the court, first says he cannot recall. He says, and I quote, "I honestly can't say whether I said it or not. I honestly don't remember." However, a few moments later, Mr. Mosteller tells the court, "I don't use those terms out in public. If I did use it, I certainly am sorry. I didn't mean to indicate any racial overtones."
What difference did racial bias make in this case? A committed lawyer would have presented the persuasive, available evidence about why Mr. Osborne should be spared the ultimate penalty.
Well, I interviewed Mr. Osborne on several occasions. I interviewed his mother and his sister. I also reviewed records of families, friends, employers of Mr. Osborne. I had the opportunity to review the trial testimony. I had the opportunity to review pertinent medical history of Mr. Osborne, of his mother, and of his father. And none of this was done at the time of trial except for a brief interview of Mr. Osborne. The offense that Mr. Osborne was convicted of is so out of character with the previous person that Mr. Osborne had been for many, many years.
The jury did hear that Mr. Osborne had been an extremely hard-working and reliable person, one who from the age of 13 contributed to the family support and was devoted to care for his very ill mother. What they did not hear was an explanation for how this exemplary kid became the man who killed. Dr. Woods explains that Mr. Osborne's collapse lay both in his genetic makeup and in his traumatic childhood.
My findings reveal that Mr. Osborne's family had a significant history of psychiatric disease that went back at least 3 generations. He had family members that had been diagnosed with depression with psychotic features. He had other family members that had significant histories of alcoholic behavior and psychotic behavior while under the influence of alcohol. His mother had been hospitalized on 2 occasions for major depressive disorder as well. Mr. Osborne also had a low IQ.
Mr. Osborne's genetic vulnerability to cognitive and psychological impairment was made worse by his physically abusive father and his mother's mental illness, an illness severe enough that she was hospitalized several times.
He comes from a family of significant physical abuse, emotional abuse as well. Mr. Osborne had a profoundly isolated and abusive childhood.
Mr. Osborne's downward slide began when he lost his job, became acutely depressed, and began using cocaine as a form of self-medication for his depression. His deteriorating mental state was outwardly evidenced by bizarre and compulsive behavior. Most dramatically, he was once found disoriented with unexplained razor cuts on his body, and, despite an apparent need for stitches, refused offers of help. When his pregnant girlfriend left him, Mr. Osborne's ability to care for himself disintegrated, and he lost 10 or 15 pounds in a short time.
Mr. Osborne's use of crack cocaine started in 1989. We see a rapid deterioration in his social behavior. Mr. Osborne is described as walking the streets, often incoherent, at times with his clothes completely disheveled. He is described in affidavits of family members and friends as using what we call repetitive behaviors. Dr. Larson described them as perseverative behaviors of folding his baby's clothes over and over again. These are the kinds of behaviors that you see when someone has gone past the voluntary stage of cocaine usage and has really moved into a psychotic stage, secondary to cocaine use. The cocaine really was an attempt by Mr. Osborne to self-medicate the major depressive disorder that he was suffering from.
Had Mosteller hired a mental health expert to evaluate Mr. Osborne, the jury would have heard how the combination of a major depressive disorder and cocaine hallucinosis played a role in his behavior at the time of the crime.
With the combination of the two, Mr. Osborne using the cocaine in order to attempt to medicate his major depressive disorder, we see a magnification of the paranoia, of the hypervigilance, of the hyperreactivity, of the misperception a reality that one might see in either the cocaine intoxication alone or in the major depressive disorder.
What difference might the information not presented by Mosteller have made to Mr. Osborne's jury?
The mitigation factors that the jury was not made aware of are multiple. First of all, the profound mental disorders that were ravaging Mr. Osborne and his family for generations. Secondly, the impact of the substance abuse, not only again in Mr. Osborne as a medical illness, not as an illness of will, but as a medical illness that, coupled with a major psychiatric disorder of depression, created these symptoms of Mr. Osborne that impaired his ability to conform his behavior to the law. What I think most compelling was that the jury did not hear the tremendous change in Mr. Osborne between the time prior to his drug use, when he was not just a good person, but an extraordinarily driven person to help others, to take care of his family.
Without this understanding of the cause of the drastic change in Mr. Osborne, the jury also had no way to predict what sort of person Mr. Osborne would be in prison. But after the prison treated and medicated Mr. Osborne for depression, he returned to the generous and hard-working person he had been before his slide into mental illness and addiction.
Currently, I'm a soldier in the U.S. Army National Guard. I've already completed basic training, and right after high school releases, after graduation, within a week or two of that date, I'm supposed to go to Fort Sam Houston in Texas to complete my training as a soldier. When I talk to other people about my father, most people are like, "Wow, I'm sorry." And I'm like, don't be sorry for me, because my father, though he may not be here physically, my father is here spiritually, emotionally, and mentally. My father does more for me from inside of prison walls than I could ever imagine another person doing for me. My dad is one of my biggest heroes in my life, because even though he made the worst decision in his life by doing that he did, he made the best decision in his life by accepting being my life. And to me, that was one of the most horrid things I could think of. Because even as my dad was a young person, and not being there, most people that age don't even want to be there for their kids, and they're out of prison. My dad is in prison and has made one of the biggest impacts on my life that I could ever think of, and I thank him for that. But as far as me not having my dad in my life, I don't know where I'll be, because I will probably still be the same little girl that was afraid to step up and stand out for herself. Same little girl that had no guidance as far as arguing with her mother all the time and being rebellious and not caring what other people had to say.
Mr. Osborne's positive influence has extended beyond his daughter.
The services that we're able to hold down at the prison on death row generally consist of about at least a half a dozen men at one time. And I see him as a leader amongst us half a dozen men, a man that is always concerned if someone doesn't show up one week for the worship service. Always asking questions of other men about their family. And so I see him as a leader. There's not a doubt in my mind that Curtis's relationship with God is right. I've seen through Curtis just how genuine people can be in their repentance to God for things that they've done.
He's very remorseful about this. I've heard him say on more than one occasion that the people didn't deserve what happened to them, and he said that he didn't want to give an impression to anybody that would make him think that it was their fault anyway. He knows that it's all on him, and he's sorry about it. He's a long ways from the person who committed that crime at that time. He's not the same person at all.
Trial counsel's rank racial prejudice and malignant heart should shame every lawyer and every official who looks the other way. Johnny Mosteller's racism deprived Curtis Osborne of the chance that his jury would have mercy on him because of his mental illness, and without your intervention, it will deprive him of his life, and Lakeisha Osborne of the good influence of her father. That racism also deprives the people of the state of Georgia of the confidence that their judicial system will be administered without regard to the color of a man's skin. Here we have a lawyer who repeatedly used the word nigger to describe his own client, a lawyer who also expressed the desire that his client get the death penalty. Mr. Mosteller made clear animosity would be expressed in harmful actions, and that he would spend no money to retain experts. It is uncontroverted and incontrovertible that, as he promised, he did not spend any money on experts for Mr. Osborne. It is intolerable to permit the execution of a man represented by counsel who hated him for his skin color and for that reason refused to investigate the penalty phase case for his life.